Tessa Wren kept her father's stoneware pottery burning on the creek bank below the town, and the respectable side of the little valley had decided her glaze was poisoning good people, when the truth was that she was only keeping the one honest trade her father had left her, and had never yet made a crock that hurt a living soul. She did not know yet that before the dry season ran the creek down to bones, and a rich man's dam took the water her kiln could not live without. A near silent man who built the town's mill wheels and had scarcely said 100 words to her would set his own name against the whole valley to save her. It had begun, the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her father, Josiah Wren, had built the pottery board by board and dug the good gray clay out of the creek bank with his own hands, and had raised Tessa in the smell of wet clay and wood smoke, teaching her to center and pull a wall up true and read a kiln by the color of its fire, until she could throw a crock that held sweet against a hard winter better than any jug freighted in from the railhead. Then a summer fever took him in 2 short weeks, and because she could work the clay as well as any potter in the territory, Tessa went on keeping the kiln alight, the one trade her hands knew, in a valley that had lately found it had no place for her, and the respectable side of the town, the side with the painted storefronts and the new church and the cattleman's wife at the head of it, looked at a young unmarried woman keeping a pottery alone, tending a kiln fire behind her own fence at all hours, and decided well before her morning was decently done exactly what that made her. The word went round the way such words always do, low and certain and impossible to answer, and it had help, for a man who wanted what she stood on had seen to it that the word had teeth. Here is the thing the town had not troubled to learn. Tessa was 26, raised at her father's elbow by a man who had no sons and taught her everything he knew because the work wanted doing, and she had never had the least gift for being ornamental. She kept one thing of his above all the good wheels and tools, a small salt-glazed stoneware cup, gray and cobalt blue. The first true pot her father had ever pulled that pleased him, the one he had drunk his morning water from for 30 years and set his glaze by. She kept it on the sill above the wheel and drank from it every working day, and the cool weight of it in her hand was the one thing in that whole cold, lonely year that still felt like Josiah and like home. And none of it would matter, because the weather and a rich man's water meant to finish what the gossip had started. The pottery lived or died by the creek. She dug her clay from its bank and drew the water for her slip and her glaze and the pond that cooled her fire from a good clear spring that fed it. But the biggest cattleman in the country had lately filed a water claim on the creek above her and thrown up a dam to turn the whole flow into his own stock ponds, and the dry season was coming on, and Tessa knew that when the creek ran down to bones her kiln would go cold and her clay to dust, and the one honest thing she had kept alive with her own 2 hands could be taken by the plain turning. Off of a stream. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season you have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Tessa is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people of town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person plain when the whole valley has made up its mind not to. The cattleman was a broad, prosperous man named Hollis Vane, who owned the best grass in the country and a good black coat and a reasonable, regretful way of speaking, and did not come to Tessa with threats, but with an offer. He rode down to the pottery himself, hat in hand, and told her in his slow, easy voice that it grieved him, that Josiah had been a fine man, but the water above ran across his range now, and a growing herd wanted every drop of it. He would buy the clay bank offer at a fair price and take the worry off her hands, and perhaps it was for the best, a creek bottom being no fit place for a young woman to keep late hours alone. He let that last part sit gently in the air, the way such men do, and wished her good day, and Tessa stood among her father's drying racks, with the cold going all the way through her. For she had nowhere to go and no wish on earth to sell the ground her father was buried above. The teeth in the town's talk had a name, and the name was Royce Deering. 2 years back, before her father took sick, Royce had come through as a traveling crockery drummer buying Josiah's ware to freight along the line, and had courted Tessa honestly enough for one summer and spoken of a settled life. Then moved on down the road without a word. But he had come back that spring, hired now as Hollis Vane's freight and supply agent, and finding Tessa alone and easy to step on, he had smoothed his own history and served his new master both at once by letting it be understood, in the worried way of a man protecting the public good, that her father's old Glaze had been leaded and sickening folk, that a family 2 farms over had taken ill from a wren crock, that a decent soul would not put up his winter meat in her poison ware. It was a lie, built to cost him nothing and her everything, and it spread through the valley like a grass fire, for a town that would not buy a fallen woman's poison crocks would hardly grieve to see her dried off her clay. The silent soul who would see her plain through all of it was a widowed millwright named Adam Frost, the closest-mouthed man ever to set up on that creek. He built and mended the mill wheels and the flumes and the head races up and down the water, slow, careful work that suited a man who could stand a whole day alone in a cold stream and not mind it. He had come west meaning to build his own grist mill on a good mill seat he had picked out, and had saved toward the water rights for years. He had lost his wife to a fever their first hard season out, and had not married again nor wished to, and had got so far out of the habit of company that people took his silence for sourness. But Adam Frost had eyes, and what they had been telling him across 2 years of hauling his timber past her gate was that the young woman the valley had decided to scorn was the finest hand with clay and fire the territory had, who had carried the pottery alone through her mourning and the whispering without once letting the town see her flinch. And he understood, the way a man who reads water understands, 2 things the whole valley would not say aloud: that Hollis Vane did not want a dry creek at all, but wanted her clay bank, and would take it the moment her fire went cold, and that Royce Deering's poison talk was a plain-built lie the town had swallowed because it was easier than being fair to a lone woman. If you've made it this far into Tessa Wren's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He came to her at the end of a long day, when the light had gone off the water and she was banking the kiln fire down for the night, the low creek talking thin over its stones behind them. He took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands, and said the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He knew it was not his place, but he had seen what Vane's dam was doing to the flow, and heard what Deering was saying, and it was not right. A thing she had not done, costing her the pottery and the good name she had kept clean. And there was one way to slow them, if she could stand it. A married householder had standing before the water board that a lone woman keeping a shop did not, and a man's name beside hers on the claim was far harder for a cattleman to buy off or dry out, and the moment she was a respectable married woman, Deering's whole ugly whisper had nothing left to stand on. If she would let him marry her, plain and quiet, and let his name stand beside hers on the ground in the water, he could buy her the time the valley meant to deny her, and the talk would lose its teeth. He would sleep in his own shack up at the mill seat and ask nothing she did not freely give. She would keep her pottery, her wheel, and her own self entire. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat, for he could not have made it any other way. Tessa did not answer that night. She lay awake over the cold shop and turned it over, for a marriage on paper to a near stranger was a hard, strange bargain. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and livelihood handed back to her, the very things the cattleman and the liar had set out to take, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, as a plain matter of what was right and not of charity. In the morning she went out and lit the kiln fire and centered a lump of clay for a waiting churn and found the pottery still hers, and when Adam came by she told him, steady, that she would take his name and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the town circuit preacher in the little parlor of Meg and Owen Kettle, who kept the feed store on the road above and stood as witnesses. There was no ring and no kiss. Because that was not what this was, Adam said the words low, looking at his own hands, and Tessa said hers, looking at the window where the last of the light came down over the creek. That evening Tessa slept over her own cold shop, a married woman, and Adam slept in the shack at the mill seat, a married man, the little gray cup dry on its sill, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that summer was the slow making of them. There was nowhere much to be but at the work, his timber and her clay, and though Adam kept faithfully to his own roof. A paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight whether two people will it or not. He built her new drying racks when the old ones sagged, timbered up the crumbling bank where she cut her clay so it would not slide, mended the leaking kiln shed and rehung the shop door so it shut true against the wind, all without being asked and mostly without a word. And she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, and began, without quite deciding to do for him in return. She kept a plate warm on the stove for whatever hour he came down off the water, mended the coat he wore to the meeting-house, and learned the sound of his maul up the creek the way you learn a clock. And the talk between them, between two people who had married to stop the town's talk, came slow and then easier, the way a cold shop warms when the fire is lit. She found he was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to, and if she did not press him the words came low, dry, and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her, a little at a time, about the wife he had lost on the trail and the grist mill he had meant to build for her and never had, and Tessa did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. And she found herself telling him things she had told no one, and the pottery had stopped being a place she merely endured. They both felt the change and were half afraid of it, for a thing built to buy a little time has no business taking root. It was the water that opened the way through, and old Owen Kettle who let the last of it slip. The dry season came down hard, and the creek fell and fell, and Tessa braced herself to see her kiln pond sink to mud. And then one gray morning she went out and found the pond standing full and clear as spring, the water coming from somewhere she could not account for. She followed it up along the bank, and found where a narrow channel had been cut and stoned in below the old dry course, carrying a steady thread of live water down from a seep in the rocks above the cattleman's dam, dug and lined by hand. Plainly the labor of many quiet nights, and she knew whose hands. She had half heard him more than once in the small hours, a maul working somewhere up the dark creek, and had told herself it was only the mill. She said nothing to Adam of the channel. But the next morning, careful, she asked Owen Kettle whether Adam still meant to build his grist mill on the mill seat come the fall. The water rights he had crossed the whole country to get, and the old feed store man, not knowing he was telling her anything, said no, that it beat him, that Adam had let the mill seat and the water rights go to another man that very spring and put the money God knew where, and that a man did not save 11 years for a piece of moving water and then walk away for no reason a body could see. Tessa stood a long moment in the bright doorway after Owen had gone back up the road, and something began to come clear that she was almost afraid to look at. That afternoon she went quietly to the county recorder's office and asked to see the water claim on the creek above her pottery. And there it was in the book. The upstream water Wright Hollis Vane had filed on had been quietly bought out from under him months before by a private party through an agent 2 towns over, so that the cattleman no longer held the senior claim at all and could not lawfully dry her out. And the private party who had spent every dollar of a mill seat and its water rights to buy it and hold it and ask nothing was Adam Frost. She walked back down the road with her ears ringing and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely lent her his name. He had taken the money he had saved for 11 long years, the mill that was the whole reason he had crossed the country, and spent every cent to buy the water claim out from under Vane so the creek could never be taken from her, and had cut a hidden channel through the dark to keep her kiln pond full besides, and had done all of it silently, so she would never see it or feel she owed him. Tessa, who had been taught too young to ask a thing of anybody, felt something she had shut away since the cold weeks her father died come loose in her chest. That evening, when Adam came down off the water and she handed him his coffee in her father's gray cup, she let her hand rest against his on the warm stoneware a moment longer than she ever had, and did not draw it back, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face and did not say one word, and everything was said. But the poison talk was still abroad, and Tessa found she was not content to let it stand. Adam had bought her the water and the ground while letting the town go on believing Royce Deering's lie, and that she would not have. The pottery could be saved with water, but her name could not, and her name she meant to win back herself, with the one trade that was truly hers. So she fired a fresh kiln of her cleanest ware, and she went back through her father's careful records and her own, the whole book of the trade, until she had what she needed, and she sent word up and down the valley that on Saturday she would answer the charge against her Glaze in the open, before anyone who cared to come. For here was the thing Royce Deering had forgotten. Her father had been a careful, honest tradesman, and every glaze he ever mixed and every batch he ever fired he had set down in a book, plain and dated, and Tessa had kept it up after him. Between her father's glaze book, her own dated ledger of sales, and a certain freight bill she had gone quietly to fetch, she had the whole truth of it in black and white. And the truth did not favor the man who had lied. Saturday came, and half the valley gathered on the flat below the pottery to see the poison woman answer for herself, with Royce Deering come along in his good coat and Hollis Vane on his fine horse at the back to watch the finish, and they found they had walked into the wrong morning. Tessa stood by her kiln with her clean ware ranged on a plank before her, and she did not make a speech. She poured clear water into one of her own new gray crocks, and drank it down before them all, and let it stand full in the sun, and she opened her father's glaze book and her sale ledger on the plank, and let the men who could read come and read the dates for themselves. The proof that her glaze carried no lead, and that not one soul the talk had named had ever owned a pot of hers. And then, plain and quiet, she laid down the freight bill beside it, dated and signed, that showed whose leaded jugs had truly gone into that sick family's cellar, and whose store they had come from, and whose hand had sold them. There was no cruel word in it. She only stood beside her own honest work, and let the valley read the dates and the names, and watch the color drain out of Royce Deering's face, and understand at last which of them had been telling the truth all along. And before the murmuring had died, Adam Frost stepped up beside her and said, low but plain, that the creek above was hers and safe. that the senior water right had been bought and held clear months since, and no dam on it could touch her, and the recorder was sent for and confirmed every word. Hollis Vane sat his fine horse a moment, with his face gone stiff, having reached for a clay bank that was never his to take, and then turned it and rode back up to his good grass, and Royce Deering was gone off the flat before the crowd had done talking, and gone from the county, they said, not long after. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply saw, in plain daylight, what they had been too quick and too unfair to see before, and a good many of the respectable wives found they had somewhere else to look. The dam above came down that fall by order of the water board, the creek ran full and sweet through the clay bank again, and Tessa kept her father's pottery, free and clear, on the ground she loved. Adam Frost had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he did the thing he had never done, and turned to face her plainly where any who cared to could see. He did not make a speech, that was not his way. He only said, low, but not so low, that Meg Kettle a step away could not hear, and later gladly tell it. That he had told her in the spring he would sign off the claim once she was safe and go his own road, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to go any road that did not have her on it, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any name got up against a cattleman and a lie, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Tessa looked at the silent man who had spent his one dream on her, and cut a channel through her dark, and never let her see it, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early fall, for true this time, in the little church that had lowered its voice about her only a season before, with the kettles and half the valley crowded into the pews, and a few of the respectable wives near the front looking a shade ashamed, as well they might. The circuit preachers said the words right at last, the clean fall light coming down through the glass. And that evening, after the last of the guests had gone, Tessa took her father's little gray cup down off the sill and filled it and set it on the mantel of the mill seat house Adam had begun to raise for them, where the low gold light came across it. The cup her father had begun a life's honest work by, and that had held sweet through a whole cold, lonely year, and had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come into that hard year a potter's heir with a shop she could not water, and a name a stranger had poisoned, certain the best of her life lay buried in the cold ground above the creek. She grew old on that bank instead, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would. And the crocks and churns and jugs of that whole valley came off her wheel for 40 years, and the wives who had once lowered their voices about her brought their whole families to her door. The old gray cup sat on the mantel still, by then, worn dearer than ever, beside a fine new potter's wheel Adam had built her with his own hands. And on the last evening of this story the two of them caught the low gold light through the window together, the old cup and the good new work. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the world has believed a lie about you and reached for the one thing you have kept alive with your own two hands, do you let their whispering and your own pride drive you off your ground? Or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the easy one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.